1969 was a real pivotal year for the Western film genre. Just right in that year, you had major motion pictures, Westerns.
So it's no mistake that suddenly we started getting different takes on the Western, different spins. Certainly, Butch Cassidy comes in on that level.
It obviously wasn't a traditional Western. It had a lot of the elements of a traditional Western, but it also had modern humor. So it was a nice mix.
From the second that I read it, I knew it was going to be a movie that everybody connected with could look back with some sense of pride.
There was probably a little fear that it was maybe either a little too clever or too much fun and games, but it was still extremely attractive script, very well written.
In the late 50s, I came across this story of these two guys. At that time, nobody knew the story. Nobody knew about Butch Cassidy or the Wild Bunch. It was an unknown piece of material. And what moved me so much about it was that they ran away. I'd never seen that before.
Whenever you expected something to turn left, it turned right.
It was like 400 pages. It was a wonderful script. I said, Larry, I like this, but Bill's got to cut this back.
So we sent it out again, and every studio but one wanted it, and there was this wild bidding for it. I wrote the movie for Paul Newman as the Sundance Kid and Jack Lemmon as Butch Cassidy, because Jack Lemmon had done a movie called Cowboy, in which he was a tenderfoot, and I thought he would have been wonderful and funny, and Newman's a fabulous actor. And I had done a movie with Paul Newman called Harper, and the first draft of Butch I brought to him.
I knew secretly that Steve McQueen and Paul were very interested. And so I bought it right on the spot.
We were so taken with it that we exceeded our legal minimum in offering money for it.
Paid $400,000 for it, which was higher than any original screenplay had been purchased before, and was like $200,000 over my contractual rights with the board of directors. But I felt so strongly about it, I gave them $400,000 and thought I'll talk the board into this later at the next meeting.
It was news all over the country, if you're paying attention. Yeah, it's probably the only screenplay that ever made the regular news.
We jeopardized our jobs to buy it, and directed by George Roy Hill.
Hill was fabulous for it. Of all the directors I've worked with over the decades, Hill's the most gifted.
When George got Butch, he really got it by calling his agent and saying, I've got to get a job. He had gotten fired off Hawaii, fired off Thoroughly Modern Millie.
George and Paul were very close. They were classmates. He wouldn't have been my first choice, but Bill Goldman was very friendly with him, and I believed in Bill and Paul.
George had a great eye for truth, and there wasn't any hesitation or indecision. He knew precisely what he wanted in a scene. He knew what he wanted from his actors.
I think should have been given to him about what an incredible director he was. He was an incredible craftsman. He had control over everything. And I think he is the essential force behind that film.
I had a globe, and we split the globe right in half. Half the prince would be McQueen, Newman. Half the world would be Newman, McQueen. I did everything conceivable, because I had the two biggest stars in the world at that time.
And so McQueen was gone.
I mean, the casting stories on that are, you know, Brando was going to do it and then he disappeared. Warren Beatty was going to do it maybe.
They had meetings and they'd go through the list of other people, and George was very amusing about sitting in the meetings and everybody in these power positions saying, yes, you know, Brando or Beatty or a number of people. And come to George and he'd say, Redford.
He was, for me, I thought, the next Jack Lemmon. He was a brilliant, brilliant Broadway star and actor and comedian. I believe to this day it was Joanne Woodward who suggested Redford.
Joanne suggested it to me. The studio wanted some other actors, and George and I both wanted Redford.
He's too clean cut, and I was totally wrong. And I've always admitted that as one of my great misjudgments.
I knew I could play the part. I mean, I was attracted to that part. I knew it, but nobody else did, because the business has got a shallow mind when it comes to using its imaginations for other things. So I was already being stereotyped.
Redford's a good actor. It's actor. Sometimes people get sort of stuck in, you know, they can't see you doing something else because they have some idea about that if you look this way, you can't do that or something.
I just had to sit for about 4 or 5 months waiting for the dust to settle. And what finally settled out was George and Goldman and Paul, and they formed, I guess, a kind of triumvirate that helped push it across. So I'm indebted to them.
I mean, so we drank a lot of beer in Mexico, and we had a great deal of fun. I tussled him in a fencing contest, and we just had a great sense of fun off stage. Worked very hard during the daytime and had a lot of fun when it was finished.
Paul and I probably began a sort of bonding really the first few days. We found a common ground of humor and values off the set that could be worked into the work on the set. It was stripped away almost immediately, the age difference of, 12, 13 years between us. The professional notoriety difference that existed, that was stripped away pretty quick, but that was Paul that did that. He just accepted that we were colleagues working together as actors. And so I think that meant a lot to me. And then what happened just developed naturally between us. We never questioned it and still don't.
When this was presented to me, I said, God, I've lived with this so long, the Sundance Kid and Butch Cassidy. Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, it just doesn't sound right, you know. But now you can never think of it sounding the other way around.
I thought I was playing Sundance, and when I said something to George about it, he says, no, that's not the character you're playing Butch.
Hot as the dickens, as I remember there, but you're, you know, playing this part. It's great. Edith Head did the costumes, you know, and so all of my stuff was made for me, and so it was beautiful and incredible looking.
You had the best locations imaginable, at least in my mind. You know, you had Zion National Park, you had Durango, Colorado. Incredible scenery, topography, varied, Western. You rode through that, it was a joy. Then Mexico. It was pretty blessed in terms of the environment that we were working in. Man, I just had a great time. I told George I'll jump on the train myself and then scamper along the top of the train. Paul came on the set and he got really upset. And it threw me because I was enjoying it. I was enjoying that I could do it. And he said, look, I don't want any heroics around here. I said, well, it's not heroic. I'm just enjoying it. He said, I don't care if you're enjoying it or not. He said, I don't want to lose a co-star unnecessarily. He said, I'm committing to this film. And so it was kind of chastisement on Paul's part that when I thought about it later, I thought, well, yeah, of course that made sense. Who was I to go out there and say, oh, I want to do this, I want to do that. And if there'd been some slip up, that would have been the end of maybe me in the film. So he was right.
I don't think it had much effect on other films. At least I'm not aware of it. But then I'm not a film historian either, so.
Westerns sort of went out of fashion. This was like the last of the Mohicans or something. So I don't think it changed anything about Westerns. It's just generally felt that Westerns are too expensive and nobody wants to see them. But all it takes is a good one.
Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid were at the very top of the list.
They were no Robin Hoods by any means. They weren't just a bunch of good old boys, you know, that kind of did some things on the sly. They were really kind of bad guys.
We got a lot of things going for us.
To be the ringleader and in control, and screwed up with his Spanish and put too much dynamite in the thing, and it was sad that he was kind of loveless during the whole picture.
A relationship that was excellent. It included Redford's having to laugh at all of Newman's god-awful jokes, and Newman had to put up with Redford showing up anywhere from 10 to 15 minutes late all the time. But to have that kind of relationship off-screen is damned important because it'll show up on-screen as well. The first day of shooting was on September 16th, 1968, on a narrow-gauge railway that runs between Durango and Silverton, Colorado. We picked this narrow-gauge railway because it was a period train that was actually operating. We had to shoot this sequence out of continuity because we were worried about snow. The train made this trip high up in the mountains where the snow can begin anywhere from the end of September on, so we had to do this scene first. There was a lot of discussion those first days as to whether this was a comedy or not. Actually, I don't think there's any difference between directing for comedy or directing for tragedy. I think the director and the actors have to go for the truth, the reality of a situation, and make it believable. If Paul Newman is in a funny situation and we believe him, we'll laugh. If he's in a tragic situation and we believe him, we'll cry. You don't play funny or play sad. You play real.
He entrusted me.
There are some stories that she was a school teacher, and that's the way Bill has it, but I think probably she was one of the prostitutes from Fanny Porter's house in Fort Worth.
Girls are a problem in Westerns because they slow up the action. And when I was working on the picture, we were always talking about that whenever you brought the girl in, make sure that things didn't come to a terrible stop, because that's a tendency in Westerns. I mean, any action picture, the girl is a bore.
In some ways, Katharine was miscast for the part. The real Etta probably had more mileage on her and was a good bit tougher. But Katharine has other great qualities going for her. She has an enormous appeal on the screen. She's cute, she's sexy as hell, and she projects a kind of a vulnerability that's very endearing. We had it built so we could shoot outside as well as inside for the moment when Butch rides around the house.
You are mine, Etta Place. Mine. You hear me? Mine. All mine.
When Bill and I were working on the script, we decided on 3 separate musical sequences in the movie. One of the reasons for them was that Etta didn't have that much footage in the picture, and we wanted to create scenes without dialogue over which we could play music and just let Katharine and Paul or Katharine and Bob improvise their scenes. Katharine does that very well and very easily. In fact, I think the musical sequences project her character and her relationship with the guys as well, if not better, than the dialogue sequences. And Connie felt that way about obscuring photographic images.
Well, that's correct, because it's reflex. And on the other camera...
We tried to shoot through things at the actors, and sometimes the actors objected in a pretty unsubtle way.
No. Now, are they all Mitchell cameras?
I'm a grandmother and a female, and I've got my rights.
Every once in a while, you run across a scene you really don't like, and that's the way I felt about the one where Bob grabs the fat lady and Butch imitates her voice.
What are you going to do to her?
The trouble with it was it just seemed phony. I couldn't really believe that Butch could imitate her voice well enough to fool Woodcock, even though I planned to help that later in the looping by switching to Paul's voice halfway through her prayer.
Thy kingdom come, thy will...
Anyway, we shot it, and people seemed to think it was funny as hell, but I don't like the damn thing, and I never will.
Well, that ought to do it. Think you used enough dynamite there, Butch?
In the movie, immediately after the explosion, the money from the safe is supposed to be floating through the air, and we had to match the floating money on each one of our subsequent cuts. We had a huge Ritter fan concealed here behind the other side of the train.
Well, the way I figure it, we can either fight or give. If we give, we go to jail. No, we'll jump. Like hell we will.
We shot the scene there up to the actual jump itself, but the water at that location wasn't deep enough for our 2 stuntmen to jump into. So we constructed a platform just off the edge of the cliff, and Paul and Bob jumped on it at the end of their scene. So the screen left to right. This is how that shot looked in production, after it was photographed through the glass, flopped to change direction, and cut into the end of Paul and Bob's scene. We shot most of our Bolivian sequences in Tlayacapan, Mexico, about 30 miles south of Cuernavaca. In colonial days, it was a main stop on the stagecoach run between Acapulco and Mexico City, but now it was mostly a farming community. The first scene we shot there was a sequence where Etta teaches the guys Spanish. Katharine had very decided opinions on how to play her part. She's a very intelligent girl, but I didn't always agree with her. Actually, my communication with her was the least good of any of the actors, and it led at times to uncomfortable moments on the set. But ultimately, if an actor or an actress has talent and a strong set of convictions, and persuasion can't move them, sometimes it's better just to back off and go with them, rather than create a situation where neither one of you gets what you want. Of course, in the final analysis, the director's working relationship with the actors is terribly important in the making of any film.
I have a feeling that George probably directs with a much tighter hand than he did on this picture. I think he kept a fairly loose one. Just as I kept very loose, I thought George was terribly rigid when we first started rehearsing. And yet, as the days of rehearsal went on, I realized that he really had points to make. They may have been in opposition to whatever viewpoint I had about certain areas of the script. So, we tangled, but it was with some affection and mutual respect, and that's always the way it should be.
Bob and Paul, besides being enormously skillful actors, are also extremely bright guys and very knowledgeable in all areas of filmmaking. And they made very real contributions, I'm sorry to say. We made a deliberate decision to go with a semi-modern sound, despite the fact that we were playing in period. The picture was designed for a contemporary feel. The characters are modern rather than traditional in approach and temperament. And Bill's dialogue, where it isn't actually anachronistic, has a very contemporary rhythm and sound to it, and we didn't want a traditional Western score.
And the ghost out,
I wanted to achieve a very special effect in the killing. I wanted to have the bandits hit and fall in a series of overlapping images in which they'd seem to be falling out of themselves. I got that effect by lining up two cameras on the same angle, overcranking one and undercranking the other. If you have really inventive actors like Bob and Paul, they often can come up with an idea that's better than yours, or at least can trigger you onto something else, and you've got to keep yourself in a position to take advantage of it. At the same time, practically speaking, I personally have got to have the security of a blueprint of the scene in my pocket, because having a whole crew standing around at the rate of close to $5,000 an hour while you're doing your homework on the set is a kind of a luxury that pictures just can't afford anymore. Another thing about Paul and Bob that I've almost never run across with major stars before was their willingness, actually their eagerness to come in and rehearse on their days off. We did that on many occasions throughout the film so that we wouldn't waste valuable crew time while we were working out our scenes. But on this kind of an action situation, the crew has to be there to plan the special effects details as you go along. A difficult and dangerous part of this sequence was getting Paul riding between the horse and the mule across the square. Stars doing their own stunt work is all right up to a point, but it's always risky to let them get into really dangerous physical situations, because if they get hurt, the whole production might have to shut down, waiting for them to get patched up and back to work. But in this case, we had to get some close-ups of him riding between them, and he did them for us. For the wider shots, we were able to use Jimmy Arnett, Paul's stunt double. To get the mule to fall, we used a technique that's illegal in the United States called a flying W. The mule's front feet are wired, and the wires run up through the saddle and out back. The mule gets up a good run, and the wrangler jerks the wires and pulls his front feet out from under him, and he goes over on his face. There's a chance of breaking the animal's neck in this technique, but fortunately we didn't. Gunfights in Westerns are always phony because the heroes shoot endlessly without reloading. So in laying out this sequence, I incorporated several definite times when Bob actually had to stop and reload before he went on, and I made a special point of them. I wanted the audience to accept the fact that we were being absolutely realistic, because actually for the dramatic effect of this final burst of firing, I wanted to take the license of letting him continue to fire without reloading, so long as it was dramatically effective. Actually, in our final cut, I never counted the number of shots he takes after his last reloading, but it must be close to 15, 18 times. Jimmy Arnett, Paul's stunt double, was the corregidor on top of the arch shooting at Bob. On this particular take, he took too long to fall, but I wasn't quick enough to cut and to stop him before he went. He took the fall onto a stack of cardboard boxes concealed behind that wall, but they weren't strong enough to break the fall, and he went through them under the cobblestones and fractured his pelvis. It took him almost 3 months to get back working again. Out of context, the scene could just be comedic in result, but in context, it had a whole other meaning.
Which says, you know, it's a great, I don't want to hear it. Okay.
Paul and Bob's playing of that scene and finding the right balance of pain and humor and hope is, I think, one of the best acting achievements I've ever seen in my experience. First, we made several quick takes of Paul and Bob running out towards camera and shooting. Then we removed the motion picture camera and took a still shot of the whole set with nobody in it. This had to be done quickly so that the shadows on the closer 35mm shot would match the wider still photograph. Then back at the studio, we froze the 35mm action as they came running out, took this last frozen frame, bled all the color out of it down to a sepia, and pasted it into a blow-up of the 8x10 still of the set. Then we rephotographed it on an animation board, pulled back to reveal Paul and Bob now as a part of a still photograph of the whole scene.
And the script floated around and somehow came to me with not much chance. The agency, I wasn't that well known at the time, and the agency thought that I'd be very right for it. I read it, and it seemed like a commercial piece, if you could make that determination then. But I can't remember how it really came to me, other than just floated around and came to me, but I was told almost straight away that, as right as it was for me, that was a long shot because they wanted stars. I was aware that there were a lot of people fighting for me, and I was certainly very moved by that. The studio didn't want me. It was 20th Century Fox, and they wanted 2 stars. I think they wanted Steve McQueen at that time and Paul. And I guess the beauty of the story, and to my fortune, Paul and the writer, and George in particular. George is the one that went to the mat for it. He said, look, it's my movie, I'm the director. And finally, as I understood it, they just kept beating him up, and he beat them up, and they kept forcing him to look at other actors, and they ran out of other actors. I didn't feel in rehearsal that anything special was happening, but I never do. Also, I was too young. At the time, I was only 30 years old, and it was a new experience. It was the first real big film. And I was so much into it as an actor. I was so much into the process of acting and rehearsing that I wasn't able to step aside like maybe the writer could, or even the director, or maybe even Paul, and say, gee, this feels this way or that way. I was too much in the process of developing the character and developing a connection with Paul. Sure, I knew it was a big thing because it was a big movie. It was advertised as a big movie. It was to be changed a fair amount from the movie that I read. The movie that I read did not really have the depth that George brought to it. It was quite jokey. And it was always anachronistic, but that didn't bother me. But I mean, it bothered some critics, but it didn't bother me. But George is the one that really gave it a kind of dimension and breadth. By opening it up, it wasn't quite so much jokes back and forth. You know, he created space for behavior and for character development that I think is what really gave the film that extra lift. My admiration for George Roy Hill. I mean, this guy really had, first of all, he was just perverse enough to make it an interesting experience. I appreciated that. He was wily and wicked and full of surprises and enjoyed being surprised back, so that made it lively and I liked it. But beyond that, George had such discipline for the work. I mean, he knew exactly what he wanted to do. He was totally prepared. He has no fat in his films, and I learned a lot from that. He really understands the importance of story. And just working with George, because that was the first real film experience I really had, was a pleasure. And it's got a carry-over resonance for me. Lulu Bettinson. Lulu Bettinson came on the set, Butch's sister. She came on the set and she looked at the situation. She said, okay, she had kind of a squinty eye. The great thing about Lulu, she lived down this little town called Circleville, and she drove over the pass, so to speak, to see us filming in St. George. And she was all tickled to see the, the horses and the cowboys and everything, but she didn't know what to expect, because how can you tell looking at just a scene being shot? And it was the scene where Harvey Logan gets kicked in the balls by Paul. And so she saw that, and she said, well, is this what the movie's going to be like, And not that it couldn't have happened, but anyway, later, because she was pretty shrewd, she was tough, and the studio didn't want her on the wrong side of things because she was a living relative. They didn't want her stepping up and saying, hey, this didn't happen, or that's not the way it was, or this is nonsense. So they were trying to buy her. And so they were having a hard time. They were trying to get her to the premiere. They wanted to get her to fly back to New Haven, Connecticut. I mean, I think they had it at New Haven because George went to school at Yale, because I wondered what we were doing there, but since it had nothing to do with Butch Cassidy. But they were trying to get her there and also get her on board to support the film. And she was like not having any part of it. She said, well, I'll see the film when I see it, and we'll see. And so they wanted to send me in as an emissary, because I lived in Utah, to talk to her. So there's this big confab in Salt Lake City with the field reps for 20th Century Fox. And most of those field guys in those days, maybe it hasn't changed, just played golf a lot. And suddenly they had all this heat and they had to do something, and they were really panicked. So they said, well, you talk to her, okay? So we all sit in the office, and she says yes, and she's very quiet and very sweet. And she says, well, I don't know. I haven't seen the film. And Mr. Redford seems like a very nice man, but I don't know. I haven't seen the film. And I don't know what I'm going to say. And they said, would you come back to the premiere? Well, I don't know. I've never been on an airplane before, and I don't know that I want to go. So they could see that she was going to be a tough case and wasn't going to be bought too easily by anything. And so finally the guy who got so desperate, he said, but look, we've got, this is a lot of money that we have, and it's in the can. This film is in the can. And she was like looking for some money. She was like looking, what am I going to get out of this? What are you going to give me to have me go to the premiere and talk nice about the film? And the guy said, well, we can't, you don't understand. The film is in the can. It's done. And she said, oh, okay. She says, well, I'm not in the can. So I knew that she and I were going to get along okay. And we did. I stayed in touch with her and close to her until her death. I went to her home years later. I did a piece for the National Geographic on riding the old outlaw trail, and it ended, the story started up in Casey, Wyoming, and ended there at her place with me talking to her. And she had letters from him when he wrote when he was away. And she was only 6 years old when he left the house. But it was really through the letters and the correspondence that she was able to stay in touch. Now beyond that, there may be myth. I don't know. I like to play practical jokes on people, and I've played some pretty good ones. But that, by far, I would have to say is I had the most with that one. I mean, it was brilliant. It was absolutely brilliant. Because I suddenly realized I'd been completely had over 2 months. 2 months of strategy and 2 months of total sandbag. Complete, you just had to love it. I mean, you just had to appreciate it. But there I was, and I thought, well, now wouldn't this be great if I could win? That would make it the best of all. And I almost did. This film was the most fun. I mean, I remember saying at one time, well, I almost felt guilty getting paid for it. It's not quite true. I did have a good time, and working with Paul was great. And we developed a lifelong friendship as a result of it, both professionally and personally. And it was born out of a very natural working relationship, so that was good. And we had so much fun doing it that has to be probably the most fun on any film I've had. I remember Bill Goldman calling me at the time and just being devastated. And he said, I don't believe these sons of bitches. I don't believe these. And then George was even worse. And they took the attitude, the hell with it. The hell with them, the hell with it. And then suddenly the film started to pick up. And of course, they both just happened to be in the neighborhood every day to see if the film was going to be picked up, gain strength. And it did. And within, I think about 2-3 weeks, it rose past whatever negative criticism there was. It just kind of blew right through it, and that was the end of that. Clearly, the critics missed the chord and very often that happens with critics, is again, they're so busy looking at it either from an intellectual or academic place, they miss what kind of a chord is really being touched with the general public. If it doesn't fit some scheme that they have in mind, they say, oh, this is no good. But the fact is, that whole business about who are those guys just caught on. you know, as the song did. I remember the song got crucified. What's that song? And I wondered what it was doing in the film myself. I said, what's that got to do with anything? Raindrops? Falling on your head? Oh, come on. Well, I was wrong, and critics were wrong. Audiences loved it. I remember the experience of the film coming out, and I was surprised by the kind of success it had, and then it just ran away. It ran into the area of fashion and kind of social. It moved into a whole social strata in our society, and so I wasn't prepared for that at all. As to why, I think it had to do with more than guys running out of time. It had to do with a certain kind of bonding and a certain kind of connection, a real friendship. Whether it's male or female, or female-female, male-male, it doesn't really matter when you can put that on film in a very real way, in a very warm way and an entertaining way. I think it has a lot of currency. So I suspect that had something to do with it. And maybe just Paul and I together, you know. Paul and I have always talking about doing another project. I guess we're both as surprised as anybody else why that hasn't happened, considering Hollywood's penchant for doing sequels. Although he and I were not interested in a sequel to either one of them. They tried to get us to do one of the Sting, Butch Cassidy, and we weren't interested in that. And but we were interested in working together in another picture. So the question is, what would that be? And you would have thought the agency, you know, basically very commerce-minded, would have done something, or the industry itself would have done something, because clearly it was a workable formula, but it just hasn't happened. There's not been a good script that has come our way that we wanted to commit to, but we would like to. This film unquestionably was the film that put me in a new place. I mean, I was known, you know, I'd done Barefoot in the Park and some other films. I'd been on the stage and in the theater, but this is the one that changed my life, where I could no longer live my life the way I had been living normally.
He was supposed to be the ringleader and in control, and screwed up with his Spanish and put too much dynamite in the thing, and it was sad that he was kind of loveless during the whole picture, but that's the way things go.
It's a historical character. There was one photograph in existence. It was more just interest in who this person was.
We don't know much about Etta Place. We know that she went by the name Ethel rather than Etta, which was a Pinkerton typo and was what she was called in the movie.
There was one account that she was an illegitimate daughter of some moneyed person. But because of the time and the mores of the times, she wasn't really recognized by whoever her father was. But she learned about horses and horsemanship from him, and may have actually met Sundance at a horse auction.
We don't know what happened to Ethel. She entered mysteriously and disappeared mysteriously, and we just don't have any solid information to find her. A lot of people have spent a lot of time trying to find out who Etta Place was, and we just don't know. In the movie, they go straight from the U.S. to Bolivia and continue holding up banks and payrolls and so forth. In fact, they went to Argentina and went straight for 4 years and ranched peacefully. And there's only documentation of 2 robberies in all of South America in all of their time down there.
They were falsely suspected of a bank holdup, and they fled and went up into Chile. And later they returned to Argentina and held up their first bank, the 3 of them plus a 4th outlaw. And then they left, went back to Chile with the money, and Ethel returned to the United States and disappeared. And Butch and Sundance ended up in Bolivia along about 1906. And they got jobs in the mine camps, and they were up there for about 2 years and working for an American named Percy for a lot of that time. And there's no real evidence that they were involved in any criminal activities in Bolivia until the end of that period, long about mid-1908. But once Butch and Sundance went to South America, the Pinkertons sort of let up on the chase a bit, and that really was the end of the Pinkertons' efforts to arrest them.
The greatest mystery surrounding Butch and Sundance is their death. Most historians agree they died in a bloody shootout in the little village of San Vicente, Bolivia.
The controversy over whether Butch and Sundance died in Bolivia was generated in large part because they were never identified as Butch and Sundance at the time they died in San Vicente. Our conclusion is that Butch's sister, Lula, was just having a little fun, and she wanted to upstage the movie and get back at Hollywood because there was a bit of resentment in the family that they never got any money out of the movie.
You know, died in South Dakota. Reason to believe, though, that he was pretty well shot up. And I think he bought it in Bolivia.
I think the thing that makes it so special is that it's stayed a legend. But it's going to only be a legend as long as no one finds out anything. Butch Cassidy's alive simply because they can't prove that he did die.
I think they did a really good job ending it that way because we don't know the true story of the end. We don't know if those two were the ones that were killed there, for sure. We suspect that. Everything points to that way, but we don't know that for sure. So that's a good way to end it. And it does perpetuate the idea that maybe they came back.